Good evening, everybody. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Somerville Planning Board. I am Mike Capuano. I am the chair of the Planning Board. With me tonight is the Vice Chair, Amelia Aboff, Rob Buchanan, Jahan Habib, Erin Gino, and Debbie Howard Easton. We have a number of items on the agenda this evening, but pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, this meeting of the Somerville Planning Board will be conducted via remote participation. An audio recording of these proceedings will be available upon request to planning@somervillema.gov. This meeting is being recorded. So we have, as I said, a few items on our agenda. There are 3 public hearings. One is 73 Summer Street, which was previously opened and heard. And they are seeking a continuance until when, Rebecca?
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is Rebecca speaking. They have asked for one to the next regularly scheduled planning board meeting, which would be November 4th.
November 4th, okay. That has been requested for a continuance to November 4th. The chair moves to continue 73 Summer Street to November 4th, seconded by Amelia. Roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Amelia votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Erin votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
Okay, unanimous vote to continue that to the 4th of November. The next is 872 Broadway, which has previously been opened. And we have a request, I believe, also to continue that one till November 4th. So the chair moves to continue 872 Broadway to the 4th of November, seconded by Amelia. Roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Amelia votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Erin votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
Okay. The next item on our agenda is 153 South Street, which is an establishment of a thoroughfare at a subdivision, which I believe is new and has not yet been opened. So I will ask the clerk of the planning board to read into the record the notice of public hearing for that application.
Yes, notice of public hearing for 153 South Street, P&Z 21-098. Boynton Yards Land Company, LLC, seeks approval of a plat plan establishing new rights of way for a thoroughfare, which requires subdivision plan approval.
Okay. Thanks very much, Rob. For those in attendance, all 5 of you, we are going to hold that agenda item to the end of the meeting. We've got also in other business recommendations to the Land Use Committee on a number of amendments to our zoning ordinance that were previously opened and were the subject of a joint hearing with the Land Use Committee a few weeks ago. So we're going to take those first. I'm looking at the list of amendments, and I would like to take up for discussion item 212308, requesting approval of amendments to the zoning ordinance for rooftop mechanicals. I would ask for any discussion by members of the planning board, but before that, I don't know if staff has any recommendations or suggestions based on the testimony that we've received and the staff's professional opinion on this suggested amendment.
Hello, Mr. Chair. This is Deputy Director Dan Bartman from the Planning, Preservation, and Zoning Division. We did get one letter of feedback from legal representation of a number of lab buildings throughout the city. It also includes a legal argument that the special permit associated with the rooftop mechanicals may violate the SCIT doctrine, which the city solicitor's office is investigating. So I don't have any feedback related to that specific public comment that was received as of yet. But that was really the only letter we had for that item.
Thanks, Dan. Do we have an idea of when the solicitor might be able to have a legal opinion on the issues that were raised by the public comments?
The chair of the land use committee has formally requested a response to that comment, and I believe that they intend to deliver that within the next 2 weeks. That's all I know, though. I know that they're actively working on an answer.
Could you remind me, either Dan or Rebecca, when the deadline is for us to be able to make recommendations to the land use committee on these agenda items? I think it was 60 days from the opening of the hearing. And while I'm obviously welcome to and excited to hear testimony, but rather comment from members of the planning board, I think that where there is an outstanding request for a legal opinion from our solicitor, we should, I'd like to hold off on a vote for a recommendation on those items until we receive that opinion, if it falls within the time period by which we have to make a recommendation. But in the interim, obviously, I'd like to hear what the board has to say. But could somebody give me that deadline?
I have 21 days.
21
That would
days?
be, yeah, 21 days from October 15th.
Okay, so we've got a few weeks.
I'd have to have Rebecca see if that falls within the next planning board meeting, but I think there's an opportunity. I don't think the city council, like the land use committee, doesn't have another meeting scheduled and isn't going to take action on this until they get the solicitor's answer either. So,
So I'm looking at the calendar now, and 21 days from the 15th is November 5th, and we've got a meeting on the 4th. So it is possible that we could have a legal opinion rendered to the board before our next meeting, which would be within the time frame for us to make a recommendation. So I would request that the board deliberate tonight, but we hold off on a vote until the 4th on this particular item until we get an opinion from the law department. So that being the case, I would like to ask members of the board if they have comments or questions on this particular agenda item. I know Amelia has mentioned that she wants to say something about this amendment, so I'm going to invite you to either go first or last.
Happy to go last, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
I have a quick item, Mr. Chair. If
Sure.
I asked to be recognized, so I can state for the record that I missed the meeting, but have watched it and then submitted the affidavit that I watched it to the city.
Thank you. And Aaron, obviously that will apply for all of the amendments.
Yep, exactly.
Thank you for making that known. Does anybody else have any, before Amelia, who had asked to go last on this, any comments or questions of staff on this particular amendment? Okay. Seeing none, Amelia, go for it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a list of 4 concerns about this amendment as currently drafted. So first and foremost, I think this is closely related. I think this is related in some ways to the inquiry that is into the solicitor's office, but I do think that there is, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the argument that was presented in the letter we received in written testimony, in calling out that specifically a special permit that would be granted sort of at this late a stage in the development process may be something that we want to take a closer look at. So typically the sizing of systems is not something that would be determined at a particularly early stage of development. And to the extent that a special permit being, and I do not have the technical background to say how readily available like substitutes for different sized systems may be at the stage that a project would be in for that special permit. So I would just like to raise the question for further discussion with staff about making sure that we are setting up this mechanism, if we are to set up such a mechanism, so that there is some at an appropriate stage in the development process, so that we are not sort of stranding a project that is 90% baked at the stage of uncertainty with the viability of systems they need to service the building they have otherwise completed the design for.
Could I pause you for 1 second, Amelia? I'm sorry. We lost Erin's video. I just want to make sure that she is still on in the meeting.
Mr. Chair, this is Rebecca speaking. I want to, I noticed that as well. I have her noted as being offline, so I'm going to try to reach out to her.
Amelia, could I ask you to hold off for just 2 seconds until we can get her back online, just to make sure that there's a quorum, but for continuous purposes, for the purpose of the argument. Erin, can you hear us?
My internet is back. I can't hear you now.
You can hear us.
Unfortunately, I dropped just as soon as Amelia said she had a list of 4 items.
And did you hear the first?
I did not, unfortunately.
Amelia, could I trouble you to repeat what you said, just so we don't have to have Erin go back and listen to a DVD of 30 seconds?
I'm trying to be more succinct. My first item was just in regards to the timing of the special permit that would be required for height exceeding the 15-foot proposed as of right maximum. I think that we need to just consult with staff on the timing that would the timing of that special permit, as I think that it's possible that a project may need to be fairly far down the development path and design path before they would be in a position to know that those height limits were being exceeded and thus be applying for the special permit. And I think that with the emphasis on lab development in the city, that could be something to just think carefully through to make sure that we're not creating a situation where there's like an unfinanceable project because there's this risk that systems might be oversized, not knowing yet what the system sizes will be and how easily systems could be adjusted to meet that tight threshold if a special permit were not able to be granted. So that was just one item that I think deserves more due diligence and discussion. The second was, right now, as currently drafted, the language specifically exempts solar photovoltaic systems from the screening requirements. And I think that we need to make sure that that exemption encompasses not only solar photovoltaic systems, but also other renewable energy technologies that need access to either sun or wind to be serving their function. So solar hot water panels and any kind of building integrated wind would also be technologies that, like, fundamentally, in order to operate, could not be screened. And I think we need to either list all 3 of those or consult with the Sustainability Office for a more expansive word that encompasses those and any other related technologies, just to make sure that we are facilitating the sustainability requirements that we've put in place for these buildings and not creating an accidental obstacle to them. My third point is a bit maybe esoteric, but in mid-rise districts currently we have a height limit, and then we would have this rooftop mechanical height limit, but we have less, somewhat less clear language on the permissibility of interstitial floors. And I was concerned that we might be, in the language as drafted, be creating a loophole where if someone were going to build something that would exceed the rooftop mechanical height limit, they might instead choose to put that in an interstitial floor in order to avoid needing to go to a special permit at a late stage of design development. And I think that that is an undesirable solution from the city's perspective and would not be accomplishing what we are trying to with this amendment. I think it would be increasing height inadvertently. It would be shifting more massive parts of the building further up, which would be impacting light and air. And most importantly, in mid-rise districts, there could also be a use like residential sort of directly abutting, and you wouldn't want, say, a 5-story lab building that was for some reason venting at its 4th floor next to someone's operable windows, right? So I think that I don't have a proposed solution of language yet for that, but I think it's something that we should discuss and consider to make sure we're not accidentally creating a pattern where, although that would be an odd design choice, it would avoid the special permit path, and I don't think that we want that. And then the last point is one that I briefly raised during the hearing, which was how a development that in its proposed design exceeded the rooftop mechanical height limit, but including the mechanicals was within the height limit overall for the building would be handled. And I guess it's my opinion that that should be permissible without an additional step of permitting, because it is achieving the same goals as would be, it's achieving what we set out to do with the height limits, just in a slightly different manner. And it's, if something were to be not fully built out, I think that's a very possible situation. So I think we should consider a recommendation that addresses that scenario as well.
Great. Thank you, Amelia, very much. Has anybody else got any questions or comments right now? It is still the intent of the chair to hold off a vote on recommendation on this particular agenda item until we've received a recommendation from the law department, so long as that recommendation is, an opinion is rendered before our next meeting on the 4th. So does anybody else have any comments or questions on the rooftop mechanicals? Rob?
Yeah, I just had a question, and maybe I'll try to tag on to what Amelia was saying. And maybe this is a question for staff, but did we consider, rather than setting, floor-to-floor height and mechanical height, just setting a aggregate height limit so that we're, getting away from some of the potential, consequences as trying to met this out floor to floor and penthouse mechanical. I'm just trying to understand what the downside would be to taking that approach. So I guess I would put that out there for staff if they want to speak to that now or next time.
Through you, Mr. Chair. I believe, so every building in the purple districts and up does come with a total aggregate building height maximum that currently does not account for the mechanicals. And I believe that Ms. Aboff is suggesting that if a building is proposed, for instance, shorter than the maximum permitted and its mechanicals happen to slide in under the total that would be permitted for actual stories of the building, that should be okay regardless of how tall the mechanical penthouse is. We don't have that functionality written into it yet, but that is an interest. I mean, that would still produce a building under the height limit that you would expect for a building with no mechanicals. So I like that idea. I haven't thought about writing like an aggregate height limit in feet that like on one line item. So essentially you would get that by the maximum building height plus the maximum height permitted for your mechanicals would produce that number. So that it is technically there. You would have to add those two numbers, but it's just not on its own line item. But effectively you could take the 5-story height limit of a commercial building and add 15 feet to it. And that would be the new total height limit for that structure plus its mechanicals.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. Yeah, the questions and the concerns that have been raised by Amelia and by Rob definitely, I think, make us as a board need to consider how we want to make a recommendation to the land use committee, so long as the opinion that we get from the law department is something that effectively says we agree that you should make a recommendation, and how we would, as you all know, can make recommendations to either not adopt, to adopt, or to adopt with modifications. So I think the concerns that you have raised and that Dan, I think has agreed with, pose a possibility that if we get to a point that we should make a recommendation to the land use committee on this, that we try to come up with some language to address the concerns that you raised to the extent that that would be possible. So I appreciate your comments, and it's giving us something I think we should all think about how to address for a recommendation if indeed we make one. So thank you both very much for that.
I have a couple other points, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yeah, sure. I didn't see your hand, sorry.
No worries, I just raised it.
Box showing the thing was over where your hand would be.
Yep. So a couple points. One, really just about the reserved language in the proposed amendment. I think it's good that there's sort of broader discretionary here in that reserved language, but I think it would be, I was looking through the ordinance, and that reserved keyword isn't defined in the glossary of terms, at least on the version available on the City of Somerville zoning ordinance site. And just sort of a sort of point of clarity for residents looking at what the ordinance means and what reserved means and how they can participate with the review process. It would be great to have something that defines better what that reserved actually means and that it's broad and discretionary. And then second point is really around the concerns from Mr. O'Shea and some of the others around, lab buildings in particular with noise concerns. And it's not, I don't know if it is necessarily really related to it's related to the rooftop mechanicals, but I also wonder if there's an argument to be made for special permits being required for lab use or biomedical research use types, especially when abutting a neighborhood area, between the traffic impacts of hazardous waste removal and controlled chemical delivery, and some of the infrastructure requirements and noise requirements, noise requirements of lab buildings. I wonder if more special consideration might be required for those types of uses when they directly abut residential areas.
Would you like me to respond to those, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please, Dan.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the reserved line is actually a legislative writing technique to hold a section to be filled in later. And we were interested in seeing what the public might identify as the concerns. The other special permits that you referenced typically have very detailed considerations in that subsection, and we didn't want to presume we knew what those were. However, we didn't get any feedback letters that identified what those concerns might be from the public. So my guess is that it's primarily related to noise, actual height, aesthetics, and the venting directionality and what might be being vented, which gets to Ms. Aboff's concern about interstitial floors venting right to the side of a building. So I imagine that we will work to write findings related to those 4 items unless anyone else identifies any other issues that should be included, including your board. So if that's something that you would like to provide feedback on for next time, we would be open to that, because those are the 4 items that we were brainstorming. But again, we didn't receive any direct feedback about what those considerations might need to be to leave any kind of neighborhood concern.
Mhm.
And then the second one is that there is a conversation happening right now that I believe is more about, it's really that we have a municipal law in the city's municipal code about laboratory buildings, and we even have a commission that's being reconstituted as we talk that hasn't been in operation for a while. That's supposed to review new lab uses that come to the city. It already prevents level 4 lab buildings, which generically speaking are the scariest for everybody. But like, to what degree should the city be involved with regulating level 1, 2, or 3, lab activity is an open question that's being debated right now, I would say. I imagine that we would continue to deal with that through the municipal code rather than the zoning ordinance, but it is a topic of conversation that's happening right now in the city.
Yeah, I'm the topics that come to mind around that, and thank you through you, Mr. Chair, are around transportation of hazardous waste, noise of always on hoods. Lab buildings also tend to be lit at night, so you have a light pollution issue, and generally transportation. Having worked in lab buildings for a number of years, you have about 10 different vendors delivering all hours of the day, especially really early in the morning for cryogenic gas, and it can be pretty disruptive.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any comments or questions on this particular amendment to the ordinance? Seeing none, we're going to continue this to the November 4th meeting, by which time we expect to have an opinion by the law department. And if we do not, hopefully my able colleagues can draft up some suggested comments or amendments or conditions that we'd like to pass along and take up for discussion for the land use committee at that time, based on what you've mentioned this evening. So then we move on to the next agenda item, which is item 212048. Dean Matarazzo proposing a zoning amendment to rezone his property at 13 Garfield Ave from fabrication to urban residential. And I don't know if staff has any sort of a recommendation on this particular proposed amendment.
The administration does not oppose the amendment, so we would be happy to see it recommended.
Okay. I thought, based on the testimony and the presentation, that this seemed to be a very reasonable request by this applicant, and I, as one member, would be happy to vote to recommend this amendment to the Land Use Committee. Does anybody else have any comments or questions of staff? Amelia?
Mr. Chair, respectfully, I do not feel necessarily equipped to recommend this amendment. I appreciate the applicant's perspective and the feedback from the community and the counselor that this would be a welcome use, but I spent a lot of time trying to wrap my head around this question and think about how to approach it. And fundamentally, while there is value to the city, I think, in creating more housing and providing more zoning that allows for dense residential development, this isn't an area where there is already a lot of residential zoning. It's abutted by sort of extensive NR and UR districts, as well as a lot that is zoned MR5 and could have some residential components. And there is not at all very much that is still FAB zoned in this geography. And my understanding of the FAB zoning is that it was really intentionally selected to ensure maintenance of Somerville's, artisanal production in some levels, and to preserve that use and preserve some parts of the city as, small scale industrial and production. And I'm reluctant to support what feels like a fairly arbitrary rezoning of one of a very small handful of FAB parcels in this geography to use that occurs much more commonly. And I tried to look back at what the property had been under the previous zoning ordinance to understand if I felt like there were rights that perhaps had been taken away through the FAB zoning. And historically, this property had been zoned as industrial. So I feel like the FAB zoning is not detrimental to the applicant as compared to the previous zoning. And if it was intentionally zoned as FAB only slightly over a year ago, I question the merit of changing that at the time.
Thank you. Amelia, does anybody else have any comments or questions on this particular proposed amendment? John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I happen to agree with Vice Chair Abel's assessment. Even though I'm sympathetic to the applicant and the considerations therein, the question of really the application zoning is also top of mind on my side as well. I would ask my fellow board members to consider the zoning of application districts and keeping that in mind as we decide to vote. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Anybody else? No. Rob?
Thank you. I appreciate the comments of my colleagues, and I was just sort of refreshing my memory on Street View to recall kind of what I'm looking at here. I think this is one of those parcels that feels very transitional to me. It has sort of light industrial on one side and residential on the other, and sort of a mixed-use area. So I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. And since I didn't hear any opposition during the public hearing, my inclination is to support the applicant's proposal to rezone as urban residential. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Erin, I'm sorry, I had my box over your hand again. I just put it over my own face. I didn't want to look at myself anyway. Go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I share Rob's opinion. I don't have a strong opinion one way or another. And I do go to the little gym across the street from this parcel. So it is a very transitional area. On one side, you have sort of your standard Philly style or triple deckers. On the other side, you have Dino's Pasta. That particular building, I mean, I could see value to the city either way. I feel like urban residential, even with a small business overlay, might serve that property very well. But I don't have a strong opinion one way or another, and because the city doesn't also have a strong opinion, I would also be inclined to support a use that would lead towards development for this parcel, where currently I think there is no use for the parcel.
Thank you. I will just say I appreciate the discussion on this particular application for an amendment, because every once in a while we do see a person who owns the parcel of land looking to change the zoning, and it always, I think, really merits a discussion for members of the board and members of the land use committee and the board of aldermen as to whether that's an appropriate change, because it's not the city after a lengthy study seeking the change. It's not a group of 10 or 20 citizens who look at a particular property and say, we think it should be X. It's the person who owns the property themselves, which can, admittedly always be, kind of self-serving. So I think these particular applications always take a little bit of extra consideration by members of the board and members of the Board of Aldermen. So when I see them, I rely on, I think as we all do, the public testimony that we receive. And I also look to the recommendation, if any, by the ward alderman. And in this case, I think it was supportive. So I don't see recommendations by the representative of this particular neighborhood. I don't take that lightly, because if it was going to be detrimental to the neighborhood, I think they would be the first person to speak up against it. So when I view this, that's kind of what I take first. And that being the case, I would feel comfortable voting to recommend a support of this amendment based on those factors. So what I'd like to do is move to recommend adoption of this particular amendment to the Land Use Committee. I'm going to see a second by Aaron, and I'm going to have a roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Amelia votes no.
Jahan votes no.
Rob votes aye.
Aaron votes aye.
Debbie votes no.
We have 3 and 3. So we have a split recommendation to the Land Use Committee. So if that could please be noted in our recommendation. The next one up is 212301 AP Davis Square Plaza, requesting the adoption of an amendment to the zoning ordinance map to rezone 4 parcels in Davis Square Plaza from MR4 to Civic and CC4. Dan, I'm going to ask you again, why is this different from what we've seen in the past? And do we have,
Mr. Chair, this is
hold on, do we have Aaron? We do. Mute, unmute, but
I'm here.
okay.
Mr. Chair, this is actually a resubmittal of the exact same proposal from last time. It timed out without any action, so they're able to resubmit.
That was my suggestion, and the recommendation from the planning board last time was a no recommendation, because we are still waiting, and when we thought at the time it was the most appropriate path forward to have the Davis Square neighborhood plan be adopted first before we started rezoning properties in what was and is within the subject area. So I think it would be inconsistent with our last vote to do something different, but I would like to open it up for discussion for anybody that has any Any comments that they'd like to make on this resubmittal? Okay. Seeing none, Erin, I'm expressly moving my box just to make sure I see your hand. Seeing none, the chair is going to move to make no recommendation to the Land Use Committee based on the reasons that were stated this evening and that were previously stated in our last recommendation to the committee on this proposed application. Seconded by Amelia. The chair votes aye.
Amelia votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Erin votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
Great. We have a unanimous recommendation for no recommendation. The next is 212305, requesting approval of amendments to the zoning ordinance for payments of certificates of occupancy. So this seems to be somewhat ministerial, but I don't know if anybody has any comments or questions of this proposed amendment, or if staff has any particular comments or recommendations on this amendment.
Mr. Chair, this was proposed by the Housing Division, and the administration does support the timing change of when these payments could be made.
Yep. That's what I expected. Just want to make sure there was nothing that was missing. Does anybody have any comments on this particular amendment? No. Okay. Seeing none, the chair votes to make a recommendation of approval to the Land Use Committee on this agenda item. Seconded by Amelia. The roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Amelia votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Erin votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
We have a unanimous vote to recommend this agenda item. The next one is agenda item 212306, requesting approval of amendments to the zoning ordinance for commercial spaces. First, I'd like to ask if, obviously, this was something that was submitted by the administration, but I don't know if staff has any further comments or recommendations to the board.
We don't have any further information to provide. We have been working with Councilor Davis to develop this adjustment to how the small business overlay district works. And we didn't have any direct feedback related to the item specifically.
Okay. So there is nothing that would, at this time, prevent us from making a recommendation or a vote to the committee. And it seems like Councilor Davis is going to be working in concert with you all to perfect it once it gets to the Land Use Committee and see where it goes from there. Does anybody have any comments or questions on this particular application? No. Seeing none, the chair votes to recommend approval of this agenda item, seconded by Amelia. Roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Amelia votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Erin votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
We have a unanimous vote for recommended approval of this agenda item. We have the next item on our agenda, 212307, requesting approval of amendments to the zoning ordinance for sidewalk and frontage clarifications. This was an amendment that was submitted by the administration. I don't know if, Dan, you have any further comments or recommendations on this agenda item. We have received, I believe, some testimony on this.
I'm sorry, my audio was cutting in and out with the specific item. Can you just repeat the title?
Sure, it's sidewalks.
Yeah, so the sidewalk one is really just a restatement in different English words of the exact same standard for 12-foot sidewalks, using terminology that's more familiar to the development industry.
Okay, so this doesn't change anybody's setbacks or anything that wasn't previously in the ordinance.
No, sir, it stays the same.
That's what I thought. Does anybody have any comments or questions on this particular agenda item? Seeing none, the chair moves to recommend approval of this agenda item, seconded by Amelia. Roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Amelia votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Aaron votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
Okay, we have a unanimous vote for recommendation of approval for that agenda item. We have discussed rooftop mechanicals. We have an agenda item relative to Boynton Yards, which we are going to hold until we go through the next one, which is 212337. 18 registered voters requesting the adoption of a zoning map amendment to change the zoning district of 51 McGrath Highway from HR to MR5 and 35 McGrath Highway from MR5 to MR4. It is my understanding that there are some negotiations happening on this particular map change, but I'm hoping that Dan or someone else on staff might be able to update us on where we are on this one.
Sure thing, Mr. Chair. So we met with the Land Use Committee on Tuesday, and if you recall the public hearing, neither the property owners or the proponent of the amendment attended the hearing. So they were invited, the people that submitted from Brick Bottom Artist Lofts that submitted this amendment were invited to come speak at the Land Use Committee meeting. They had sent 2 representatives and had identified that they had conducted their own shadow study based on the zoning of the 2 parcels that they're targeting and the shadow impacts on their building. The Land Use Committee requested to see that shadow study. And so there was a lot of conversation about how that might be transmitted and who might look at it. There was a request by multiple counselors that the planning board also be shown this shadow study. So we're working with the applicant to figure out the right way to deliver that, whether it be a PDF of images, the same way that a developer might submit that in their site plan approval application, or whether or not, looking at that visualization in some other manner would be appropriate at a following meeting. There was also a request to invite the property owners that would be impacted by this map change to provide their own testimony. And so we were following up with them to invite them to another Land Use Committee meeting and to hopefully a follow-up planning board meeting, because the Land Use Committee expressed their interest in having your board not make a recommendation until it's reviewed this additional information and had the applicants and the property owners impacted testify to your board. So with the if you're willing to do that, then we would move to invite both of them to your follow-up meeting and to also work with them to try and figure out the right way to transmit the shadow study information.
Yeah, thanks very much. I as one member would welcome the opportunity to have a further discussion with everybody involved who are stakeholders in this application. I don't want to, until I see that additional information, I don't feel prepared to make a recommendation to the Land Use Committee. And it's their request that we not do so until we get that additional information. So I would be of the opinion that we should hold off any discussion on this agenda item until we get that additional information and have a further discussion and testimony with the stakeholders involved here. But I would like to ask my fellow board members if they have any comments or questions at this time. Yes, Rob.
Yeah, I had a question. In my notes, and I guess I'm looking for someone to correct me if I misunderstood the public the testimony, but I thought I heard in my notes that someone on the staff side had indicated that they believe that this application may be considered spot zoning. Am I misremembering that? And I only ask because in my limited time on the planning board, the last time I think the city solicitor's office made that statement, you know, we made a no recommendation vote because of that. But am I misremembering? Could someone clarify for me?
Through you, Mr. Chair, you are not misremembering. That was the chaotic night where my bathroom flooded while I was reading the solicitor's opinion. So that
Right.
You're not misremembering that.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else at this time?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Amelia.
sorry. I'm not sure if it's fully salient to the decision-making process here, but I guess one item that I feel like could use clarification is whether the claim is being made that genuinely that sort of it is the function of the building as an artist live work building that is being negatively impacted here, or whether it is simply sort of a residential building that, like any other residential building, people are angry about potentially about increased shadow. Because I think that is the only thing that separates this from what I would normally see as spot zoning in terms of, you know, a residential building being unhappy with development. And if that is the argument that is being made, I guess I'm slightly more confused about it.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments or questions at this time? Okay, see none. It's my preference. Even if we do come out with a no decision recommendation as we have in the past, I would like to see if and how this may get either resolved or worked through a little bit more until our next meeting, when we might have a little bit more clarity on what sort of a recommendation we should make. I have no issue continuing with our tradition of making no recommendation when the law department has identified something as a reasonable threat to a challenge for spot zoning. But it seems like there is discussion going on that might get to a point where that might be remediated or not. So I would like to reserve a vote on this until our next meeting to see what, if anything, has come of those discussions. And if the answer is we, still look at making a no recommendation, then that's the case. But I'd like to make sure that we kind of exhaust the opportunity of the stakeholders to work through this a little bit more before we make that recommendation. I don't know if people have any opposition to letting the process work out a little bit more over the next couple of weeks. I don't see any harm in doing so. So that being the case, the chair is going to move to continue discussion of this agenda item to the November 4th meeting. Do I have a second? Seconded by Erin. Roll call vote. Thank you for using the other hand. The chair votes aye.
Amelia votes aye.
John votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Erin votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
You have a unanimous vote to continue this to November 4th. The only other items on our agenda that I see, I'm just double checking our amendment discussion. The only two that I see are an amendment for Boynton Yards and the the subdivision at 153 South Street, which is also Boynton. So I think that being the case, this might be the time for Amelia to nod off and recuse herself.
Mr.
you
Chair,
very
this is Rebecca speaking. One more thing before Vice Chair Aboff leaves, if I may. Thank you for taking the making the motion and taking the vote to continue that most recent case. I just wanted to note that we had discussed, let me find the number, I'm sorry. We had discussed another meeting about the lab building, another item with the lab meetings. We're taking a recommendation from the city solicitor, and at that point, you had moved on to the next item without officially taking that vote. I'm hoping that we could do that, go back and do that now.
Sure, that's agenda item 212308 on rooftop mechanicals.
That's correct. Thank you.
So the chair moves to continue discussion on that agenda item to November 4th, seconded by Amelia. Roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Amelia votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Aaron votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
Thank you all. Unanimous vote to continue that one. Thank you for correcting the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, I will now recuse myself if that's all right.
Thank you, Amelia. Have a nice night. See you in a few weeks.
Thank you.
Amelia has gone. We still have a quorum. We're going to take up item 212309, requesting approval of amendments to the zoning ordinance for MPD and Boynton sub area. So I don't know if staff has any further comments or recommendation for the board. Obviously, this is something that was proposed by the administration.
We don't have any further comments, but yes, this was intended to address buildings that are in close proximity to new development and how we might allow that new development to shy further away from those existing buildings. That's it.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments or questions on this agenda item? Rob?
Yeah, I had two questions for staff. Is there an inventory of the properties that this would affect? And it's fine if the answer is no. And I ask because, as best as I could tell, it was just one parcel or possibly two. And then I guess my second question was, this is with respect to the 20-foot rear setback requirement. I assume the rear setback is in relation to whatever is designated the front of the building. And with respect to corner lots, in particular, the one that's sort of on the corner of Webster and Windsor, if it's a corner lot, is there a 20-foot setback requirement then under this amendment or not? I guess I'm trying to understand how that would work in practice for a corner lot. Are you able to able to shed any light on that for me?
Sure. If through the chair, if you can imagine a corner lot being the shape of a square, the two lots abutting that corner lot would only have side lot lines, and there'd be no rear setback. However, when a corner lot happens to occupy or be made out of all of the land that might be the end of an entire block, like the example you're talking about, that lot even goes around that corner and then down the other street. In that circumstance, there is a portion that has a rear lot line because the lot that it abuts also has a rear lot line. So in that case, 80 Webster has a rear lot line, and 495 Columbia as a parcel has to reflect that rear condition. But it's that's the only portion of it that is a rear, and the other lines end up being sides. So it ends up being, because the corner lot is complex in its geometry, it generates that's where it generates the rear setback. Otherwise, a corner lot that is simple geometry, just a square, doesn't have that same condition.
I understand you. Complicated, but I get it. Thank you.
Bob, did you have a second question? You said two. I don't know if you asked your second.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's the question. I think this just affects that one parcel from a existing condition standpoint. Do you happen to, this is a question for staff, do you happen to know if there are other parcels that this amendment would impact?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we haven't created an inventory, no. We did this from a matter of principles, essentially, like when there are existing buildings that, for example, the 80 Webster building does not comply with the rear setback on its own parcel. The zoning, however, always anticipated a 20-foot separation between new development and existing development, and expected alleys that are also required to be 20 feet wide to be provided in the blocks of Boynton Yards. This is a unique circumstance where Beach Street does supply the alley access, but not continuously behind the building like what is generically anticipated from, rectilinear simple geometry. But again, because of the unique site condition, it meets the alley requirement, but doesn't end up producing the 20-foot setback between buildings. So this is an effort to try and re-engineer that distance between buildings. You'll recall that there was a comment made about the distance between buildings on the D2 parcel and how that provided an alley. But it is also, beyond the alley, there's much more distance between the existing buildings and the new development, primarily because that lot is shaped like a trapezoid, and it provides a lot more depth to the lot. So where you have shallow lots or standard size lots, you're going to have less ability to provide an increased distance between new development and existing conditions. So the other side of Boynton Yards does have MR properties mapped and lower scaled existing buildings. And if any of them were to have a similar site condition, the new development abutting those lots would have a similar functionality to pull their development away from those existing buildings. So we look at it as something that could apply to both sides, but I have not created an inventory.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, Aaron.
Kind of thinking on, how this might apply to existing buildings. I was curious, Dan, if you have any comments about how the 5% deviation might apply for some other buildings. Just like, I would like to walk through maybe some scenarios where that 5% like wiggle room might sort of help development where it might be kind of contentious otherwise.
Sure. The 5% rule is really it's not 5% on top of any kind of percentage in the code. It's 5% of whatever that dimension is in reality. So if your setback's required to be 10 feet, you could reduce or increase it by another 5%. But the tool is really used in this circumstance to, when you're pulling the building away from the rear, you may create non-conformities in your building width or floor plate size and other things like that, because you're adjusting the shape of the building where it would normally be pushed back further into the lot and actually a smaller size. So, you know, if you think if you're, especially on a corner condition like we know exists, that shape is moving outward, but also extending itself in length slightly. So there's not, the 5% rule is about accepting those adjustments as close enough, essentially, to the same, the like building width and floor plate dimensions to not be considered non-compliant. But it's not really intended to provide further relief than what is already indicated. So decreasing the front setback and sidewalk width potentially from 18 feet to 12 feet. You know, that 6 foot of difference is what is afforded in the code, and there's not like a 5% rule that would further that. The 5% rule is applied in this circumstance to accept that 6 foot difference and any kind of impact it might have on other dimensions. I haven't looked into the possibility of any other dimensions that might be relaxed or increased as a 5% rule, because we're already moving the building a distance away from that rear property. But I'm not aware of any other dimensions that we might be able to apply a 5% fungibility to, and happy to have them, you know, brought to my attention. But I didn't find anything else that I thought was deserving of a 5% margin of error when we scanned through everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, you know, having that little bit of fungibility, especially when you're right up next to potentially non-conforming, you know, older development, does help provide some flexibility. So that makes sense to me, and that scenario really helps me think through what the impacts of that are. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anybody have any comments or questions on this particular application for a recommendation to the land use committee? Seeing none.
Sorry, I actually have one more going through my notes here, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, of course.
There was a comment made during the public hearing that there was still a pending agreement with the developer sort of behind this area. And sort of my question to staff is there any recommendation or any opinion from the city whether or not, or sort of what the status is, or what we should kind of think about that pending agreement?
Through you, Mr. Chair, so from a legal standpoint, any kind of like private agreement shouldn't influence the decision making of zoning map change. It's like outside information, but we all know they brought it up their own. The developer of 495 Columbia and the residents of 80 Webster are working privately to come to an agreement about how things will work, from everything from construction timing and lighting of the building in the future to the size of the building and how it will be stepped back and how tall the mechanicals are. That will provide the development team and the residents more surety about what will come from the proposal that is way more detailed than what is in the zoning amendment. Between the two of them, they're trying to hammer out, details that fall underneath the maximums permitted in zoning, but are, rein that building in a little bit more. So I know that, like, for instance, moving the front portion of that building into the high-rise district actually removes any kind of height limit at all from what was previously being called 64 Webster. Now that it's all one lot, the high-rise district would allow a high-rise building in that location. but the plan is to build a 9-story building, and so they're working to have that part of the agreement, but is not intended to be part of what the consideration is about whether or not the zoning map change and the functionality added to Boynton Yards is deserving of being adopted. Any kind of private agreement is outside of, it's supposed to be outside of that decision making.
Yeah, thank you. It seemed to me also kind of a bit like a red herring, but it was, you know, there in the recording, so I figured I'd ask.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the question, Aaron, and the clarification, Dan. Unless it is a formal opinion by the law department that we would be best not to act on a particular agenda item, I generally don't view side negotiations in a recommendation like this, but it is something to note, particularly if it's an actual application that's coming to us for a special permit, for example. It has been the practice of this board to try to let the stakeholders work out agreements before we take a vote, if that's something that can be done. We've done that in, for example, the D2 parcels for Union Square with the collective, the community benefits agreement, as well as a number of other applications that we've seen. So that's certainly something that we do take into consideration when it's an application before the board, but for a recommendation on a map change or an ordinance amendment, that's not something that we traditionally take into account. But thank you for raising that. Does anybody have any comments or questions in addition to Aaron's on this particular agenda item? Rob.
Yeah, I had one very quick question. I just to follow up as I'm rereading this more closely. With respect to the proposed amendments and the public realm, I'm looking at the very last page of the red line. It states, you know, that if I'm understanding it, that the for a lot that meets the condition here that we've been discussing, that the provision for total sidewalk width would be 12 feet. I guess a question for staff, without this, is the current ordinance, my recollection is the ordinance requires a 20-foot sidewalk, and this would allow going down to a 12-foot sidewalk. Am I understanding this proposed amendment correctly?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that is correct. The entire zoning ordinance required 12-foot sidewalks when they were not present for every single zoning district. We had received a public comment when we were adopting the ordinance in 2019 that suggested larger sidewalks would be valued for high-rise development. And so that's why the 18-foot was changed for that zoning district, or the 12-foot was changed to 18-foot for that zoning district. We did not do it for the commercial core district, which does also produce some high-rise buildings, which is, you know, probably an oversight. But the thing I want to point out is that we always believed that 12-foot sidewalks were the minimum necessary for every zoning district prior to the discussions about, you know, would even more facilitate the number of pedestrians that might be moving in and around a high-rise building. So we don't look at this as creating a detrimental situation. It is less width, certainly, but we always believed that increasing our sidewalks to at least 12 feet would meet the need. Certainly bigger, you know, wider sidewalks are better. This amendment, I will say that this amendment is, I guess, best characterized as a compromise between, you know, difficult decision making about how to fit some development in when neighboring buildings are very close, and one of the only available remedies is to narrow the sidewalk. Although they will be widening the sidewalk from what its existing condition is today to 12 feet, just not 18. So it's like a trade-off between the public realm and shying away from that building at the rear. And it's a trade-off. Certainly we'll acknowledge that.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, just one follow-up question, just to make sure I'm pushing this as far as would there be a limitation for, I understand, couldn't the first floor be set back farther? I mean, let the upper stories, project out maybe over the sidewalk. 12 feet, it feels roomy to me, but once you throw in street trees and park benches, and there's usually a kind of a 2-foot curb area, now you're down to a walk path of 6 feet. It seems to me that if the ground floor, provided even just a little bit more space, and the upper stories were allowed to project over the sidewalk, that sort of, from a compromise perspective, sort of, we all come out kind of generally back to where we started. Is that not allowed, to allow the building to project over a public sidewalk?
Through you, Mr. Chair, actually the first floor is permitted, of any building, is permitted to be recessed up to 15 feet. The floors above the first story can only recede from their plane that they're built at. So like the third floor can only recede from the second floor, and so on. That is us defending the limited amount of square footage that we will ever be able to build in Somerville. But the first floor of many buildings is frequently recessed to, for weather protection or to provide just a little bit more room for sidewalk space. I know that the proposed building for this location has slid itself forward without changing its floor plan, from my understanding of what is in that location. So for instance, some of the mechanicals, ground level mechanicals, like fire safety room, the generator room, and the bicycles, long-term bicycle parking is in that area of the building, along with some like elevator shafts and things. I don't know whether or not it is feasible for them to recess the first floor at all. That doesn't mean it's not preferable, but I haven't looked into whether or not they could carve away any more space. Also could be something that for them to figure out. But yes, we have many buildings across the city being proposed to have a slightly recessed first floor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for clarifying some of that concern that Rob had. I think you did. I don't know if that satisfied Rob's questions or concerns. It seems like it has. Does anybody else have any comments on this particular amendment before we move forward? Seeing none, the chair will move to recommend approval of this agenda item to the Land Use Committee. Seconded by Jahan. Roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Aaron votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
We have a unanimous vote for recommendation to the Land Use Committee. Next on our agenda is a case, an application at 153 South Street. I would like to invite the applicant to be unmuted and to have their team introduced, to the extent that they have a team that's going to make a presentation.
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is Rebecca speaking. I am unmuting Rolla Idris and Kevin Griffin, and I believe that Kevin might want to be made a presenter. Can you confirm that for me?
Yes, please. This is Kevin Griffin. If you could make me a presenter, that'd be great.
Great.
Thank you. And just a reminder for people who will be making the presentation, for anybody that's going to make testimony, do please introduce yourself for the record.
This is Kevin Griffin with Leggett McCall Properties. Can you see this screen here?
Kevin, this is Rebecca speaking. I think you're going to want to go full screen because we can see everything, but it's cut off a little bit.
Got it. 1 second. Is that more visible?
That's better, yes.
Okay. So thank you. This is Kevin Griffin with Leggett McCall Properties. We are co-developer with DLJ. You probably recall we were just at the planning board a couple weeks ago. Tonight we are seeking approval for subdivision for a few of the lots at Boynton Yards. So just rewinding a couple weeks ago, you've seen this image, so I will keep it brief on this, but we've got building 101 South Street nearing completion in the next couple months. And then we recently received planning board approval for site plan approval on building 2 and civic space 1. And so the subdivision requested in the application is related to those parcels. Going back to earlier this year, when we received a master plan special permit approval from the planning board, I'm just showing this for context. This is the approved master plan here. Again, building 1 that is nearing completion now, built out there today. Building 2 and civic space 1 that received approval just recently. In that master plan special permit from earlier this year, there was a preliminary lotting plan approved with that, which is shown here. Coincides with those buildings and the roads and the civic spaces that you just saw in the previous plan. And so tonight we are seeking approval for a portion of these lots to be subdivided to kind of their final state. And so I will just kind of show quickly the lotting plan as it exists today. With the 101 South building is here. These buildings are now demolished, and we've got the future building 2 site and civic space here with the future thoroughfare eventually running through this site. Our subdivision that we're requesting is shown here, so very similar to what you just saw. The 101 South parcel comes into conformance with that lotting plan, which in effect takes a portion of the northern portion of the site, contributes it to that future thoroughfare lot, takes a western portion, contributes to that civic space lot, and then creates a small parcels over here that eventually get contributed to the right-of-way of Earl Street. Also on the west side of the site, a small portion is created for a separate lot here that eventually gets contributed to the Windsor Street right-of-way. So these are the primary lots being created in this subdivision. And that's pretty much it. Do you have any questions?
I don't. It's pretty straightforward. I'm wondering if anybody on the planning board has any comments or questions from staff, or if staff has any comments they'd like to make to us before I open it up to public testimony. No?
Mr. Chair, this is Andrew Graminsky with Plan Preservation and Zoning. Could I speak?
Of course you can.
Thank you very much. I just want to bring up with the board that tonight this is for preliminarily plat approval, subdivision approvals. There's 2 steps. Right now, this is the first step to get a preliminary plat approval for this subdivision plan. And after if there is approval tonight, there will be the decision and then the formal appeal process. And then after that is complete, the applicant will come back for final plat approval in front of the planning board.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, what I'd like to do, there are 3 people who are listed as attendees. I believe all of whom are affiliated with the application, but what I'd like to do is open up the public hearing for testimony. So anybody that wants to speak in support of the application, please click the raise hand button and I'll call on you. Seeing none, I'm going to close that portion of the public hearing and open it up to anyone that wants to speak in opposition or express concern about the application. Seeing none, I'll close that portion of the public hearing and open it up to any further discussion by members of the planning board on the application at 153 South Street. Okay. I do not see any. And in that case, following public testimony, review of the submitted materials and deliberation of the required considerations outlined by the Somerville zoning ordinance, I move to approve with the conditions that are listed in the staff memorandum, the application for subdivision plan approval. Seconded by Rob. Roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Aaron votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
Great. Thank you all very much. Congratulations to the applicant. We will reconvene in a few weeks to take up some further agenda items and those amendments that we have moved to continue. So the chair moves to adjourn, seconded by Aaron. Roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Aaron votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
Thank you all very much. Have a nice night.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Thank you.
Have a good night.